Chapter 9 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 9. The meeting in Mr. Simeon's library lasted all through the summer afternoon, till the edge of evening. The large and gloomy room was darkened by Venetian shutters, nearly closed over open windows. There was air and the ceaseless sound of traffic, but the summer sun was excluded, and figures were seen dimly, as if they belonged to the shadow world. Among those indistinct forms, Vera recognised people she knew, people she would never have expected to find in a society of mystics. A statesman, a poet, 3 popular novelists, and half a dozen of the idlest women of her acquaintance, 2 of whom were the heroines of romantic stories, women over whose future friends watched and prophesied with the keen interest that centres in a domestic situation where catastrophe seems imminent. Vera wondered, seeing these 2, had they come, like her, for a refuge from the tragedy of life? They had not come for an escape from sin, for, if their friends were to be believed, the border line had been passed long ago. An hour of silence, broken now and then by deep breathing, as of agitation, and sometimes by a stifled sob, and then a flood of words, speech that was eloquent enough to seem inspired, speech that might have come from him who wrote Christmas Eve, and Easter Day, and A Death in the Desert, the speech of a believer in all that is most divine in the promise of a future life. And after that burst of impassioned utterance, there were other speakers, men and women, the men strong in faith, strong in the gift of tongues, possessed by the higher mind that spoke through organs of common clay; the women semi-hysterical, romantic, eloquent with remembered poetry. But in men and women alike there was sincerity, an intense belief in that close contact of disembodied mind, sincerity that carried conviction to an imaginative neophyte like Vera Provana. Suddenly, from the stillness there came a voice more thrilling than any Vera had heard in that long séance, a voice that was not altogether unfamiliar, but with a note more intense, more poignant than she knew. Gleaming through the shadows, she saw eyes that flashed green light, and a long thin face of marble pallor, in which she knew the face of Lady Fanny Ransom. And now came the most startling speech that had been heard that afternoon, the passionate advocacy of free love, love released from the dominion of law, the bonds of custom, the fear of the world, love as in Shelley's wildest dreams, but more transcendental than in the dreams of poets, the love of spirit for spirit, soul for soul, pure to pure, as Milton imagined the love of angels. All the grossness of earth was eliminated from that rarefied atmosphere in which Francis Simeon's disciples had their being. Their first and indispensable qualification was to have liberated thought and feeling from the dominion of the senses. While still wearing the husk of the flesh, they were to be spirits, and not till they had become spirits were they capable of communion with those radiant beings whose earthly vesture had been annihilated by death. To Vera there was an awful beauty in those echoes of great minds, and her faith was strong in the belief that among this little company of aspiring mortals there hovered the spirits of the illustrious dead. She left Mr. Simeon's room with those others, who dispersed in absolute silence, as good people leave a church, with no recognition of each other, stealing away as from a service of unusual solemnity. They did not even look at each other, nor did they take leave of Mr. Symeon, who stood by one of the shuttered windows, gravely watching as his guests departed. 'Twas past 7, and the sun was low as Vera went to her carriage, which was waiting for her in Burlington Gardens. She was stepping into it when a too familiar voice startled her. She had been too deep in thought to see Claude Rutherford waiting for her at the gate of the Albany. "Send your carriage home, Vera, and walk through the Green Park with me. You must want fresh air after the gloom of Simeon's Egyptian temple." No, I'm going straight home." "Indeed you are not." And without further argument he took upon himself to give the order to the footman. "Your mistress will walk home." She would have resisted, but it was not easy to dispute with a man who had a way of taking things for granted, especially those things he wanted. It would have been easier to contend against energy, or even brute force, than against that nonchalant self-assurance of an amiable idler, who sauntered through life, getting his own way by a passive resistance of all opposing circumstances. "I have been waiting nearly 2 hours," he said. "It would be hard if you couldn't give me half an hour before your dinner. I know you never dine before 8:30. "But I have to be punctual. Aunt Mildred is coming to dinner, and Susie Amphlett." "It has only just struck 7. You shall be home before 8, and I suppose you can dress in half an hour." "I won't risk not being in the drawing-room when Aunt Mildred comes." "Lady Okehampton is a terror, I admit. You shall be home in good time, child, but I must have something for my 2 hours." "How absurd of you to wait," she said lightly. "And how did you know I was at Mr. Symeon's?" They were going through the Albany to Piccadilly. She had recovered from the shock of his appearance, and was able to speak with the old trivial air, the tone of comradeship, an easy friendliness, without the possibility of deeper feeling. It had seemed so natural before the consciousness of sin, and it had been so sweet. This evening, as she walked by his side, she began to think that they might still be comrades and friends without the shadow of fear, that her agony of awakened conscience had been foolish and hysterical, imaginary sin, like the self-accusation of some demented nun. "How did I know? Well, after calling at your house repeatedly, only to be told you were not at home, I lost my temper and determined to find out where you were, at least for this one afternoon, when I knew of no high jinks in the houses of your friends, and so, having asked an impertinent question or two of your butler, I found that Symeon had been with you yesterday, and guessed that you might be at his occult assembly this afternoon. I had heard a whisper of such an assembly more than a week ago, so you see the process of discovery was not difficult." "But why take so much trouble?" "Why? Because you have treated me very badly, and I don't mean to put up with that kind of treatment. If it comes to why, I have my own why to ask, a why that I must have answered. What ignorant sin have I committed that it should be Darwaza banned when I call in Portland Place? What has become of our cousinship, our memory of childish pleasures, the sea, the woods, the heather, the pony that ran away with you while I stood with my blood frozen, telling myself, 'If he kills her, I shall throw myself over the cliff'? What has become of our past, Vera? Is blood to be no thicker than water? Is the bond of our childish affection to go for nothing? Is it because I am a failure that you have cut me?" "I have not cut you, Claude. How can you say such a thing?" "Have you not? Then I know nothing of the cutting process. to be always out when I call, to take infinite trouble to avoid me when we meet in other people's houses. The cut direct was never more stony-hearted and remorseless." "You must not fancy things," she said lightly. They were in the Green Park by this time, the quiet Green Park, whence nursemaids and children had vanished, and where even loafers were few at this hour between afternoon and evening. She spoke lightly, and there was a lightness at her heart that was new. It was sweet to be with him, sweet to be walking at his side on the old familiar terms, friends, companions, comrades, as of old. His careless speech, his supreme ease of manner, seemed to have broken a spell. She looked back and thought of her troubled conscience, and all the scheming and distress of the last 2 months, and she felt as if she had awakened from a fever dream, from a dreary interval of delirium and hysteria. What danger could there be in such a friendship? What had tragedy to do with Claude Rutherford? This airy trifler, this saunterer through life, was not of the stuff of which lovers are made. He was a man whom all women liked, but he was not the man whom a woman calls her fate, and who cannot be her friend without being her destroyer. How could she ever have feared him? He was of her own blood. His respect for her race, the race to which he belonged, would hold him in check, even if there were no other restraining influences. The burden of fear was lifted, and her spirits rose to a girlish lightness as she walked by her cousin's side with swift footsteps, listening to his playful reproaches, his facetious bewailing of his worthlessness. From this time forward she would treat him as a brother. She would never again think it possible that words of love, unholy words, could fall from his lips. No such word had ever been spoken, and was it not shameful in her to have feared him, to imagine him a lover, while he had always shown himself her loyal kinsman? In this new and happy hour she forgot that it was her own heart that had sounded the alarm, that it was because she loved him, not because he loved her, that she had resolved upon ruling him out of her life. Perhaps this evening, after the glamour of Mr. Symeon's assembly, she was fey. This sudden rush of gladness, this ecstasy of reunion with the friend from whom she had compassed heaven and earth to hold herself aloof, seemed more than the gladness of common day. She trod on air, and when they pulled up suddenly at Hyde Park Corner, it was a surprise to find that they had not been walking towards Portland Place. "We must make for Stanhope Gate and cross Grosvenor Square and Bond Street," Claude said gaily. "We have come a long way round, but a walk is a walk, and I have no doubt we both wanted one. Perhaps you would prefer a cab?" "No, I like walking, if there is time." "Plenty of time. You walk like Atalanta, if that young person ever condescended to anything but a run." "Do you remember our walks in the woods, and the afternoon we lost our way and could not get home for the nursery tea?" "You mean when I lost my way, and you had to tramp the shoes off your dear little feet. Brave little minx, I shall never forget how plucky you were, and how you kept back the tears when your lips quivered with pain." Once launched upon reminiscences of that golden summer, there was no gap in their talk till the lions' heads were frowning at them on the threshold of Vera's home. She was flushed with her walk, and the colour in cheeks that were generally pale gave a new brightness to her eyes. That long talk of her childish days had taken her out of her present life. She was a child again, happy in the present moment, without the wisdom that looks before and after. "Good-bye," said Claude, and then, pausing with his hand on the moody lion, "if you had some vague idea of asking me to dinner, it would be a kindness to give shape to the notion, for I shan't get a dinner anywhere else. My mother is in the country, and a solitary meal at a restaurant is worse than a funeral." Vera hesitated, with a faint blush, not being able utterly to forget her determination to keep Claude Rutherford out of her daily life. "Lady Okehampton expects to find me alone," she said. "But you have Susie Amphlett." "Susie invited herself." "As I am doing. 3 women. What a funereal feast. As bad as Domitian's black banquet. Your aunt dotes upon me, and so does Susan. You will score by having secured me. You can say I threw over a long engagement for the sake of meeting them. I dare say there is some solemn dinner invitation stuck in my chimney glass. I often forget such things." The doors were flung open, and the suave man in black and his liveried lieutenants awaited their mistress's entrance. "À ce soir," said Claude, as he hailed a prowling hansom, and he was seated in it, smiling at her with lifted hat, before Vera had time to answer him. "Mr. Rutherford will dine here this evening," she told the butler. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 10. Vera was walking up and down her drawing-room at 20 minutes past 8, dressed in one of those filmy white evening gowns with which her wardrobe was always supplied, one of her mermaid frocks, as Lady Susan called them. This one was all gauzy whiteness, with something green and glittering that flashed out of the whiteness now and then to match the emerald circlet in her cloudy hair. The tender carnation that had come from her walk was still in her cheeks, still giving unusual brightness to her eyes. She had been happy. She had put away dark thoughts. Life was gay and glad once again, glad and gay as it had always been when she and Claude were together. A load had been lifted from her heart, the vulgar terror of the conventional wife, who could not imagine friendship without sin. The things that she had heard that afternoon had given a new meaning to life, had lifted her thoughts and feelings from the commonplace to the transcendental, to the sphere in which there was no such thing as sin, where there was only darkness and light, where the senses had no power over the soul that dwelt in communion with souls released from earth. She no longer feared a lover in the friend she had chosen out of the common herd. Lady Okehampton sailed into the drawing-room as the silvery chime of an Italian clock told the half-hour. Her expansive person, clad in amber satin, glowed like the setting sun, and her smiling face radiated good nature. She put up her long glass to look at Vera, being somewhat short-sighted physically as well as morally. "My dear child, you are looking worlds better than when I last saw you. You were such a wreck at Lady Mohun's ball. Looked as if you ought to have been in bed, doing a rest cure. A ghost in a diamond tiara. I find that when a woman is looking ill, diamonds always make her look worse. But tonight you are charming. That emerald bandeau suits you better than the thing you wore at the ball. You haven't the aquiline profile that can carry off an all-round crown." Claude and Lady Susan came in together. "My car nearly collided with his taxi," said Lady Susie, when she had embraced her friend. "But I was very glad to see a man at your door. From what you said this morning, I expected a hen party. Now, a big hen party is capital fun, but for 3 women to sit at meat alone, the idea opens an immeasurable vista of boredom. I always feel as if I must draw the butler into the conversation, and bandy an occasional joke with the footman. No doubt they could be immensely funny if one would let them. It was an afterthought. said Claude. Vera took fright at the 11th hour and admitted the serpent into her paradise. No doubt Adam and Eve were dull. A perpetual tete-a-tete, tempered by tame lions, must soon have palled, but at least it was better than 3 women yawning in each other's faces after exhausting the latest scandal. I think the early dinner in Paradise Lost quite the dullest meal on record, said Claude. To begin with, it was vegetarian and non-alcoholic. A man and his wife, the wife waiting at table, and one prosy guest monologuing from the eggs to the apples. There is no mention of eggs. I don't think they had anything so comfortable as a poultry yard in Eden. No Buff Orpingtons, or White Wyandottes. Only eagles and nightingales, said Susie. And at this moment the butler announced dinner in a confidential murmur, as if it were a state secret. He was neither stout nor elderly, but in his tall slimness and grave countenance there was a dignity that would have reduced the most emancipated of matrons to good behaviour. "I should never dare to draw him into the conversation," whispered Susie, as Claude offered his arm to Lady Okehampton. "Nothing would tempt that perfect creature to a breach of etiquette." The hen dinner, relieved by one man, was charming. Not too long a dinner, for one of the discoveries of this easy-going century is that people don't want to sit for an hour and a half, steeping themselves in the savour of expensive food, while solemn men in plush and silk stockings stalk behind their back in an endless procession, carrying dishes whose contents are coldly glanced at and coldly refused. The dinner was short, but perfect. Too short for the talk, which was gay and animated from start to finish. Lady Susan and Mr. Rutherford were the talkers, Vera and her aunt only coming in occasionally. Lady Okehampton, with a comfortable common sense that was meant to keep the rodomontade within bounds. Claude was an omnivorous reader, and had always a new set of anecdotes and epigrams with which to keep the talk alive. Anecdotes so brief and sparkling that he seemed to flash them across the table like pistol shots. French, German, or Italian, his accent was faultless, and his enunciation clear as that of the most finished comedian, while in the give and take of friendly chaff with such an interlocutor as Lady Susan, he was a past master. Vera did not talk much, but she looked radiant, the lovely embodiment of youth and gladness. Her light laughter rang clear above Susan's, after Claude's most successful stories. Only once during that gay repast was a graver note sounded, and it came from the most frivolous of the party, from Susie Amphlett, who had one particular aversion, which she sometimes enlarged upon with a morbid interest. Age was Susan's bugbear. "I think of it when I wake in the night, like Camilla in Great Expectations," she said, looking round the table with frightened eyes, as if she were seeing ghosts. The grapes and peaches had been handed, and it was the confidential quarter of an hour after the servants had gone. "I don't like to give myself away before a butler," Susie said, as the door closed on the last of the silk stockings. "Footmen are non-existent. One doesn't stop to consider whether they are matter or only electricity. But a butler is a person, and can think. Perhaps a socialistic satirist, seething with silent scorn for his mistress and her friends." "And no doubt an esteemed contributor to one of the society papers," said Claude. "I'm not afraid of democracy, nor the English adaptation of the French Revolution, though I feel sure it is coming," continued Lady Susan, planting her elbow on the table in an expansive mood. "I am afraid of nothing except growing old. That one terror swallows up all trivial fears. They might take my money, they might steep me in poverty to the lips, and if I could keep youth and good looks, I should hardly mind." Again she looked at the others appealingly, like a child that is afraid of Red Riding Hood's wolf. "Age is such a hideous disease, the one incurable malady. and we must all have it. We are all growing old. Even you, Vera, though you have not begun to think about it. I didn't till I was 30. As we sit at this table and laugh and amuse ourselves, the sands are falling, falling, falling. They never stop. Glad or sorry, that horrible disease goes on, till the symptoms suddenly become acute. Grey hair, wrinkles, gout. But are there not some mild pleasures left in the years that bring the philosophic mind? Asked Claude. Does that mean when one is 80? At 80 one might easily be philosophic. Everything would be over and done with. One would be like old Lord Trawley, who said he was dead, though people did not know it. Some of the most delightful people I have known were old, and even very old, said Claude. But they didn't mind. That's the secret of eternal youth, my dear Susie. Not to mind. To wear the best wig you can buy, and not to pretend it is your own hair. To wear pretty clothes, especially suited to your years. Sumptuous velvet and more sumptuous fur, like a portrait of an old lady by Velasquez. Never to brag of your age, but never to be ashamed of it. The last phase may be the best phase, if one has the philosophic mind. "Oh, you!" exclaimed Susan scornfully. "You are like Chesterfield. You will have your good manners till your last deathbed visitor has been given a chair. A fine manner is the only thing that time can't touch." Vera saw her aunt looking bored, and smiled the signal for moving. "Half a cigarette and I shall follow," said Claude as he opened the door for the trio, "unless I am distinctly forbidden." "Why should we forbid you? You are an artist, and you know more about frocks and hats than we do, after years of laborious study," said Lady Susan, and then, with her arm through Vera's, as they went slowly up the broad staircase, with steps so shallow that people accustomed to small houses were in danger of falling over them. "Isn't he incomparable?" she exclaimed. "There never was such a delightful failure." "Poor Claude," sighed Lady Okehampton. "I suppose it is only the men who fail in everything who have time to be agreeable. If a young man has a great ambition and is thinking of his career, he is generally a bear. Claude has wasted all his chances in life, and can afford to waste his time." "It was a pity he left the army," said Susan. "He looked lovely in his uniform. I remember him as he flashed past me in a hansom one summer morning after a levee, a vision of beauty." "It was a pity he got himself entrapped by a bad woman," said Lady Okehampton with a sigh. "His Colonel's second wife," put in Lady Susan. "Isn't it always the elderly Colonel's second wife?" Lady Okehampton gave another sigh. "It was a disgraceful story," she murmured. "Let us try to forget all about it." Vera had flushed and paled while they were talking. "But tell me about it, Aunt Mildred," she said, with a kind of angry eagerness. "Where was the disgrace? More than in all such cases? A wicked woman? A foolish young man? Very young, wasn't he?" "Not 25." "Where was the disgrace?" "Don't excite yourself, child. Duplicity, an old man's heart broken. Isn't that enough? An elopement or not an elopement. Something horrid that happened after a regimental ball. I know nothing of the details, for it all took place while the regiment was in India, which only shows that Kipling's stories are true to life. The husband would not divorce her, which was a blessing, or Claude would have had to marry her. He spoilt his career by the intrigue, but marriage would have been worse." Vera's heart was beating violently when Claude sauntered into the room presently, and made his leisurely way to the sofa where she was sitting aloof from the other two, who had just entered upon an animated discussion of the last fashionable nerve specialist and his methods. "What has made you so pale?" Claude asked, as he seated himself by Vera's side. "Was our walk through the streets too much for you? I should never forgive myself if—" "You have nothing to be sorry for. The walk was delightful. My aunt and Susie have been talking of unpleasant things." "What kind of things?" "Of your leaving the army. You have never told me why you threw up your career." "My career? There was not much to lose. The Boer War was over. My regiment was in India all the time, and I never had a look in." "Oh, they have been telling you an ugly story about your poor friend, and it will be 'The door is shut' again, I suppose." "Why did you not tell me of your past life? I have told you everything about mine." "Because you had only nice, innocent things to tell. My story would not bear telling, and why should you want to know?" "There should not be a wall between friends, such friends as we have been, like brother and sister." "Do brothers tell old love stories? Stale, barren stories of loves that are dead?" "Perhaps not. I oughtn't to have spoken about it. Come and talk to Aunt Mildred. Her carriage has been announced, and she'll be huffed if we don't go to her." Claude followed meekly, and in 5 minutes Lady Okehampton had forgotten that it was 11 o'clock, and that her horses had been waiting half an hour. He had a curious power of making women pleased with themselves, and with him. He always flattered them, but his flattery was so discreet and subtle as to be imperceptible. It was rather his evident delight in being with them and talking to them that pleased, than anything that he said. "Come to Rivermead for next Sunday. It will be my last week-end party before we go to Scotland," Lady Okehampton said to him before she bade good night. "Vera and Susan are coming. We shall be a small party, and there will be plenty of bridge." Claude accepted the invitation as he took Lady Okehampton to her carriage. "I wish Provana was not so much away from his wife," she said. "It is a very difficult position for Vera." "Vera is not la première venue. She knows how to take care of herself." "That's what they always say about women. But is it true in her case? She is very young, and rather simple, and knows very little of the world." "Not after 6 years as the wife of a financial Croesus," murmured Claude, while he arranged the matron's voluminous mantle over her shoulders as carefully as if the outside atmosphere had been arctic. He knew that the drift of her speech had been by way of warning for him. Dear inconsistent soul! It was so like her to invite him to spend 3 days with her niece in the Saint-Gêne of a riverside villa, and 5 minutes afterwards to sound a note of warning. He walked along the lamplit streets with the light foot of triumphant love. Vera's pale distress and unwise questioning had set his heart beating with the presage of victory. Poor child! For his acute perceptions, the heart of a woman had seldom been a mystery, and this woman's heart was easier to read than most. Poor child! She had been trying to live without him. She had fought her poor little battle, with more of resolution and of courage than he would have expected from a creature so tender. She had kept him out of her life for a long time that had seemed an eternity for him in his longing for her, and then, at a word, at a smile, at the touch of his hand, she had yielded, and had let him see that to be with him was to be happy, and that nothing else mattered. Light love had been his portion in the light years of youth, but this was no light love. He had sacrificed his career for the sake of a woman, but the sacrifice had been forced upon him, and it had killed his love. But now he was prepared for any sacrifice, for the sacrifice of lifelong exile and strained means. He thought of a home in a summer isle of the great southern ocean, like Stevenson's, or, if gaiety were better, in some romantic city of Spanish America. There were paradises enough in the world. There would be no one to point the finger of scorn where society was a word of no meaning. He would carry his love to the world's end, beyond the reach of shame. Nothing mattered but Vera. Yes, there was one who mattered, his mother. But tonight he could not even think of her, or if he thought of her, it was to tell himself that if Provana divorced his wife, and he and Vera were married, his mother would be reconciled to the inevitable. Her religion would be a stumbling block. To her mind, such a marriage would be no marriage. Tonight he could not reason. He would not see obstacles in his path. Vera's pale looks and anxious questions had been a confession of love, a forecast of surrender, and in the tumult of his thoughts there was no room for hesitation or for fear. He thought of his love now as duty. It was his duty to rescue this dear girl from a loveless union with a hard man of business, old enough to be her father, from splendours and luxuries that had become as dust and ashes. He had known for a long time that she cared for him, but he had never reckoned the strength of her attachment. Only this afternoon, in her radiant happiness, as they walked through the unromantic streets, only in her pale distress tonight, as she questioned him, had he discovered his power. And now there seemed to be but one possible issue, a new life for them both. His mother's absence from London was an inexpressible relief to him. How could he have met the tender questioning of the eyes that watched over his life, and had learned how to read his mind from the time when thought began? How could he have hidden the leaping, passionate thoughts, the sense of a crisis in his fate, the ardent expectation, the dream of joy, the fever and excitement in the mind of a man who is making his plan of a new life, a life of exquisite happiness? End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 11. It was Saturday, and they were at River Mead, one of those ideal places that seem to have been raised along the upper Thames by an enchanter's wand, rather than by the vulgar arts of architect and builder, so exquisitely do they harmonise with the landscape that enshrines them. No hideous chimney, no mammoth reservoir, no thriving metropolitan high street defiled the neighbourhood of River Mead. All around was rustic peace, green meadows and blue waters, amidst which there lay gardens that had taken a century to make, grass walks between yew hedges and labyrinths of roses, and in the distance purple woods that melted into a purple horizon. It was a place that people always thought of as steeped in golden sunlight, but not even in the glory of a midsummer afternoon was River Mead quite as lovely as on such a night as this, when Claude and Vera strolled slowly along the river path in the silver light of a great round moon hung in the blue deep of a sky without a cloud. The magic of night and moonshine was upon everything. The mystery of light and shadow gave a charm to things that were commonplace by day, to the white balustrade in front of the drawing-rooms, to the flight of steps and the marble vases, above which the lighted windows shone golden, the gaudy yellow light of indoor lamps shamed by the white glory of the moon. The windows were all open, and the voices of the card-players travelled far in the clear air. They could even hear the light sound of their cards, manipulated by a dexterous hand. Everybody was playing bridge. Everybody was absorbed in the game, winning or losing, happy or unhappy, but absorbed, except these two. everybody except these two, who had been missing since 10 o'clock, and the great stable clock had sounded its 12 slow, sonorous strokes half an hour ago. They had not been wanted. The tables were all full. 2 or 3 of the players had looked round the room once or twice, and, noting their absence, had exchanged the quiet smile, the almost imperceptible elevation of arched eyebrows with which, in a highly civilised community, characters can be killed. For Lady Okehampton, she who had more than once sounded the note of warning, and who should have been on the alert to see danger signals, from the moment the tables were opened and the players seated, the world of men and women outside that charmed space, where cards fluttered lightly upon smooth green cloth, 4 eager faces watching them as they fell, had ceased to exist. She was not a stupid woman, but she had a mind that moved slowly, and she could not think of 2 serious things at once. For her, bridge was a serious thing, and from tea time on Saturday till this Sunday midnight, bridge had occupied all her thoughts to the exclusion of every other consideration. Smiles might be exchanged and eyebrows raised when, on Sunday morning, Claude Rutherford carried off her niece 2 miles up the river to a village church, which by his account was a gem in early Gothic that was worth more than the 2 miles sculling a light skiff against the current. But Lady Okehampton was too absorbed even to wonder whether there was anything not quite correct in the excursion. Why should not people want to see the old church at Allersley? It was one of the lions of the neighbourhood, and counted among the attractions of River Mead. Lady Okehampton's cards on Saturday night had seemed to be dealt to her by a malignant fiend, an invisible devil guiding the smooth white hands of human dealers. She had lain awake till the Sunday morning bells were ringing for the early service to which good people were going, fresh and light of foot, with minds at ease. She had tossed and turned in her sumptuous bed in a feverish unrest, playing her miserable hands over and over again, with the restless blood in her brain going round and round like a mill-wheel, or plunging backwards and forwards like a piston-rod. There had been no time to think of Vera and Claude. She could think only of Sunday evening, and of her chance of revenge. It was not that she minded her money losses, which were despicable when reckoned against the price of Okehampton's autumn sport. £2,000 for a grouse moor and a salmon river, an outlay of which he talked as lightly as if it were a new hat. The money was nothing. He would give as much for an Irish setter as she lost in an evening. But the vexation and humiliation of a long evening's bad luck were too much for nerves that had been strained to snapping point by many seasons of experimental treatment all over Europe, and the mistress of River Mead had left her visitors to amuse themselves at their own sweet will until dinner time on Sunday evening, while their hostess slept in her easy chair by the open window of her morning room, soothed by the lullaby of the stream running down the Weir, and sweet airs from a garden of roses, such roses as only grow in a riverside garden. The choice of amusements or occupations after luncheon on the Sunday afternoon was somewhat limited. 2 girls and their youthful admirers played a 4-handed game of croquet. A middle-aged spinster, who had been suspected of tricky play on Saturday, trudged 1.25 miles to the little town, where there was a church so old-fashioned as to provide a substantial afternoon service for adult worshippers. Most of the masculine guests wrote letters, or read Sunday papers in the billiard-room, or slumbered in basket chairs on the river lawn. Vera and Claude did nothing out of the common in strolling up the hill to the wood, where they lost themselves during the lazy 2 hours between the end of a leisurely luncheon and the appearance of tea-tables in the shady drawing-room. Coming back a little tired after her idle afternoon, Vera sat on a sofa in the darkest corner of the spacious room, by the side of a comfortable matron, an old friend of her aunt's, with whom she exchanged amiable truisms and mild opinions upon books, plays, and sermons, a kind of talk that demanded neither thought nor effort, while Claude sat among a distant group, bored to death, but smiling and courteous. After tea there was the garden till dressing time. Everybody was in the garden, so it was only natural that these two should be sauntering in lanes of roses, exchanging light talk with other saunterers, and lingering a little at the crossing of the ways, where the slow drip of a fountain made a coolness in the sultry evening, or stopping at an opening in the flowery rampart to look across the blue water towards the grey old tower and listen to the pensive music of church bells. These two had been alone all day, without interference or espial from chaperone aunt, unconscious of observation, if they were observed, alone in this little world of summer verdure and sunlit water, as much alone as in a pathless wilderness. All that long summer day they had been alone, talking, 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 as only lovers talk. And now, at midnight, they were still alone in the garden that was changed in the moonlight, changed from the warm glow of colour to the silvery paleness and mysterious shadow, in which the prolific clusters of the Félicité perpétuelle looked like the ghosts of roses. If it were sin to love, the sin had been sinned, from the hour in which he had drawn the confession of her love from the lips that he kissed for the first time. She had tried to hold him off, tried to keep those lips unprofaned by the kiss of guilt. They were alone in the wood on the hill that fatal Sunday afternoon, safe only for the moment, since the woodland path was a favourite walk with visitors at Rivermead. But he had drawn her from the footpath into the shade of great beech trees, and they were alone. He had kissed her, and she had submitted to the guilty kiss, and she knew that she was lost. Did she love him? She whispered yes. With all her heart and soul? Yes. Could she be happy if he left her for ever? No, no, no. Could she give up all the world for him, as he would for her? The lips that he had kissed were too tremulous for speech. She hid her face upon his breast and was dumb. "The die is cast," he said in a low, grave voice, "and now we have only to think of our future." Our future? Henceforth they were one, united by a bond as strong as if they had been married before the high altar in Westminster Abbey, with all the best people in London looking on and approving the bond. Nothing else could matter now. They belonged to each other. He was to command, and she was to obey. It was almost as if, in the moment of her confession, her personal entity had ceased. In all those hours of delicious intimacy, in fond imaginings of their future life, the thought of her husband had never come between her and her lover. And to-night, when she thought of Mario Provana, it was only to tell herself that he had long ceased to care for her, and that it would not hurt him if she were to vanish out of his life. Provana had been gone more than 14 days, and his cabled messages told her of delays and difficulties. The financial crisis was more serious than he had anticipated, and he would have to see it out. He had sent her several messages, but only one letter, a kind letter, such as an uncle might have written to a niece. But it seemed to her there was no love in it, not even such love as he had lavished on his daughter. There was nothing left of the love that had wrapped her round like summer's sunlight, the strong man's love that had made her so proud of having been chosen by him, so tranquil in the assurance of her happiness that nothing could change. The change had come before they had lived a year in that great gloomy London house, when she had been less than 2 years a wife. It was after parting with Claude in the garden and creeping quietly up to her room in the second hour of the new day, while doors were beginning to open and voices to sound as the card players bade good night. It was in the stillness of the pretty guest chamber that Vera began to think of Mario Provana, and the impassioned love that had ended in a frozen aloofness. He had said, "Let there be no pretending." Could he have told her more absolutely that his love was dead, and that no charm of sweetness in her could make it live again? She had made her poor little attempt to win him back, and it had failed. What more was left but to be happy in her own way? End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 12. The season was dying hard. Lady Leominster's ball at the great old house at Fulham was the last flash of an expiring fire. The Houses of Parliament had closed their historic doors. The walls of the Royal Academy had been stripped of their masterpieces, and empty themselves looked down upon dusty emptiness. All the best theatres were shut. London was practically empty. The few thousand lingerers in a wilderness of deserted streets bewailed the inanity of the daily press. There was nothing in the morning papers, and the evening papers were worse, since they were obliged to echo the morning nothingness. The people who never read books were longing for something startling in those indispensable papers, were it even a declaration of war. Suddenly their longing was satisfied. The morning papers were devoured with eagerness. The evening paper was waited for with feverish expectancy. All of a sudden, the great army of the brainless found themselves with something to think about, something to talk about, something upon which to build up hypotheses to which, once built, they adhered with a fierce persistency. There had been a murder in the heart of London, in one of the fine houses of the West End. Not one of the finest, for, after all, spacious and splendid as the house might be, it was not like Berkeley or Devonshire, Lansdowne or Stafford. It was only one in a row of spacious houses, the house of a foreign financier, a man who dealt in millions, and who was himself the owner of millions. Mario Provana had been murdered in his own house, shot through the heart by an unknown assassin, who had done his work well enough to leave no clue to his identity. Speculation might rove at will. Theory and hypothesis might run riot. Here was endless talk for dinner tables, inexhaustible copy for the newspaper. A man of great wealth, of exalted position in the world of finance, not commerce. Here was no dealer in commodities, no manufacturer of cocoa or sugar or reels of cotton, but a man who dealt in the world's wealth, and could make peace or war by opening or closing his money bags. People who had never seen the great man's face in the flesh were just as keenly interested in the circumstances of his death as the people who had dined at his table and had known him as intimately as such men ever are known. A rough print of his photograph was in every halfpenny paper, and the likeness of his beautiful young wife was travestied in some of them. Pictures of the house in Portland Place, front and back view, were in all the papers. Columns of picturesque reporting described the man and the house, the beautiful young wife, the sumptuous furniture, the numerous household, the splendid entertainments which had made the house famous for the last 6 or 7 years. And for the murdered man himself, no details were omitted. Interviews were invented in which, during the last year, Signor Provana had expounded his opinions and views of that sphere of life in which he exercised so vast an influence, his ideas political, his tastes in art and literature, music, and the drama. Minute descriptions of his person were given in the same glowing style. The picturesque reporter made the dead man alive again for the million readers who were panting for details that would help them to strengthen their own pet theory or to crush an opponent. Thousands of sensation hunters went to Portland Place to look at the house that held that dreadful mystery of a life untimely cut short by the hand of a murderer. Loafers stood on the pavement and gazed, as if their hungry eyes would have pierced dead walls and darkened windows. The loafers knew that the house was in charge of the police, and that a vigilant watch was being kept there. They wondered whether the lovely young wife was in the house. They pictured her weeping alone in one of those darkened rooms, yet were inclined to think that her friends would have insisted on her leaving that house of gloom, and would have carried her off to some less terrible place for rest and comfort. The first idea was the correct one. Vera was lying in that spacious bedchamber behind 3 windows on the 2nd floor, where ivy-leaved geraniums were falling in showers of pale pink blossom from the flower boxes. She was lying on the vast Italian bed, lying like a stone figure, while Susan Amphlett sat by the bed and wept and sighed, with intervals of vague, consoling speech, till, finding that speech elicited no reply, and indeed seemed unheard, she had at last, in sheer vacuity of mind, to take refuge in the first book within reach of her hand. It was one among many small volumes on a table by the bed. Omar Khayyam. Oh, what a dreary book, thought Susie, who was beginning to feel her office of consoler something of a burden. She had hated entering that dreadful house, as she always called it in her thoughts, since she had heard of the murder, and now to be sitting there in that deadly silence, in that grey light from shrouded windows, to be sitting there with the knowledge that only a little way off, in another darkened room at the back of the dreadful house, there lay death in its most appalling form, was a kind of martyrdom for which Susie was unprepared, and which she was not constituted to suffer calmly or lightly. As she had hated old age, so, with a deeper hate, she hated death. To hear of it, to be forced to think of it, was agonizing, and to visualize the horror lying so near her, a murdered man in his blood-stained shroud, made her start up from her easy chair and begin to roam about the room in restlessness and fear. She lifted the edge of a blind and peered into the street. The sight of the people staring up at the house was comforting. They were alive. There were people standing in the road, looking up with widened eyes, so absorbed in what they saw or wanted to see, that they ran a risk of sudden annihilation from a motor car, and skipped off to the opposite pavement, there to content themselves with a more distant view. "There never was such a murder," Susie said to herself. "I think every soul in town must have come to look at this horrid house since 11 o'clock this morning." It was now past 3, in a dull, sultry afternoon. Susie spent all the intervening hours in the silent room in the dreadful house. She was sorry for her friend, but she was still more sorry for herself. All those hours of silent horror, without any luncheon, and no good done. What was the use of sitting by the bed, where a woman lay dumb and motionless, unconsoled by affectionate murmurs from a bosom friend, apparently unconscious that the friend was there. Lady Susan called in Hanover Square on her way home, and ordered a black frock, lustreless silk that would stand alone, with a shimmer of sequins flashing through crape. Not this week's fashion, nor last week's, but the fashion of the week after next. The style that was coming, not the style that had come. This was her one agreeable half-hour in all that dismal day. "I may be dining with Vera next week, and it will be only kind to wear mourning," Susan told herself, as she ordered the gown. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah in Brighton. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 13. Mrs. Provana's French maid was the first witness at the coroner's inquest. The first question she had to answer was as to when she had last seen Mr. Provana alive, and the same question was put to all succeeding witnesses. The answer in each case was the same. Neither any member of the household nor the confidential clerk from the city had seen the deceased after he left London on his journey to New York. It was Louison Dupuis, Mrs. Provana's maid, who had discovered the dead man lying on the floor of his dressing room, close against the door of communication with her mistress's bedroom. Hers had been the first foot on the principal staircase that morning. No other servant was licensed to tread those stairs in the routine of their servitude. The rooms they slept in and the stairs by which they went up and down were at the back of the house, remote from the principal staircase. Mademoiselle Louison looked scared and trembled a little as she told her dreadful story. It was her duty to carry Madame her tea at 7 o'clock. Madame desired to be called at that hour, even when she had come home from a party after midnight. The witness stated that the still-room maid had the tray ready for her at 10 minutes to 7, and that she went up the staircase of service with it to the second floor, and through the palier outside Madame's room, and thence through the open doorway of Monsieur's cabinet de toilette. She saw a figure lying with the face downward. She had reason to believe that Monsieur Provana was in America. Nothing had been said in the household of his expected return, yet she knew at the first glance that the man lying there was her master. He was a man of imposing figure, not easily mistaken. The horror of it had unnerved her, and she had rushed down this great staircase to the hall, where two of the footmen were opening windows and arranging the furniture. She told them what she had seen, and one of them went to fetch Mr. Sedgwick, the butler. Her evidence was given in a semi-hysterical and somewhat disjointed manner, with occasional use of French words for familiar things, but the coroner had been patient with her as an important witness, being the first who had cognizance that murder had been done in the night silence. Alfred Sedgwick, the butler, was a very different witness, self-possessed and ready, eager to express his opinion and having to be held with a tight hand. He described with studious particularity how on leaving his room on that morning, having just finished dressing and having been kept waiting for his shaving water, he had run against Mademoiselle, who was rushing along the passage in a frantic manner, pale as death and with eyes starting out of her head, a young person who was apt to excite herself about trifles, and who on this occasion seemed absolutely demented. On hearing Mademoiselle's statement, given in so distracted a manner that only a person of superior intelligence could find out what she meant, he had immediately sent out one of the footmen to the police office to fetch a capable officer. It was no case for the first constable called in from the street. He, Sedgwick, had then gone upstairs with another of the men, and had found the dead body lying, as Mademoiselle had stated, against the door of communication with Mrs. Provana's bedroom. The face was hidden, but he had not an instant's doubt as to the dead man's identity, for, apart from the commanding figure, the left hand was visible, on which the witness observed an old Italian ring with his master always wore. He had touched the hand and found it was the hand of death, yet in the circumstances he had considered it his duty to telephone for the doctor. The room in which the body lay was used by his master as a dressing room, but it was also used by him as a study, and there was a large office desk in front of one of the windows, at which Mr. Provana sometimes sat writing late into the night. There was also a safe in which his master was supposed to keep important papers and possibly cash. It was not a large safe, but it was of exceptional strength and of the most modern and costly make. This safe was open when the police took possession of the room, after the removal of the body under the doctor's superintendence. There were no signs of disorder in the room, except that the pistol case on the desk was open and both pistols were lying on the floor, one near the hand of the deceased, the other near the desk. The safe had not been forced open. The key was in the door, one of 3 small keys on a steel ring engraved with Signor Provana's name and address. His master always carried these keys in one of his pockets. When was Madame Provana informed of her husband's death? Not until 8:30, when Lady Okehampton came. Mrs. Manby, the housekeeper, went in a cab to Berkeley Square to tell her ladyship what had happened, and Lady Okehampton came to the house in the cab with Mrs. Manby. Had not Mrs. Provana been awakened by the sounds of voices and footsteps on the landing? No, everything had been done with the utmost quiet. There had been no talking above a whisper. His mistress had been at the ball at Fulham Park, and had not come home till 3:00, and she was still sleeping when Lady Okehampton went into her room. The doctor was the next witness. The medical evidence did not take long. In answer to the coroner, the doctor stated that he was in the habit of attending the household, and had been summoned by telephone immediately on the discovery of the tragedy. The body was lying facing the door between the 2 rooms, and at no great distance from it. It was semi-prone on its left side, the arms extended from the body but flexed. A loaded pistol lay close to the fingers of the right hand. Life was extinct. Blood had trickled from a wound in the back of the head and formed a pool on the floor. The direction of the trickle from wound to floor was vertical. There were no other bloodstains. A further examination demonstrated that the wound was due to a bullet, that the bullet had entered the head horizontally and penetrated the brain. The bullet was found to fit a pistol lying in the room, recently discharged, evidently companion to the one already mentioned. Both fitted a case found on a table in front of the window. The witness was of opinion: 1. That death was due to shock from bullet wound. 2. That death had been almost instantaneous, and had taken place within 3 hours of the time when the witness examined the body. 3. That the wound was not self-inflicted nor accidental, but that the shot had been deliberately fired and at no great distance. The person who fired the shot was probably somewhat taller than the deceased. Upon this Sedgwick, the butler, was recalled, and there followed an exhaustive interrogation as to the arrangements on the ground floor of the house. A plan had been made of the doors and passages on this floor: the great double doors of ceremony opening into the hall, the tradesmen's door, and another door communicating with the stables, which were almost as spacious in that old London house as in a country mansion of some importance. At the back of the hall there was a wide stone corridor leading to the door opening on the stable yard, and other passages to pantry, plate room, lamp room, and the men servants' bedrooms, which were all on the ground floor. He valeted his master when he was at home, but he did not travel with him. Mr. Provana required very little personal attendance. He had always been aware that his master kept loaded pistols in the case on his desk. He understood that there was a large amount of valuable property in that room, where the deceased used often to sit writing late at night, with open windows in summer time, when Mrs. Provana was at evening parties. The pistols were in charge of the police on a table in court, old-fashioned duelling pistols, choice specimens of Italian workmanship. The door at the end of the corridor was often used by Mr. Provana, and one of the keys on the ring before mentioned was the latch-key belonging to this door. He was in the habit of walking to the city, and he used this door every morning, passing the stables on his way. He was very fond of his horses, and he often went into the stables and had the horses brought out to look at them. The stable yard opened into Chiltern Street. This door, communicating with the well-guarded stable yard, was fastened with a latch lock and heavy bolts, but the bolts were not often used, and Sedgwick said that it was by this door his master must have entered the house on the night of the murder, as the doors in Portland Place had been bolted and chained at 10 minutes past 3 o'clock after Mrs. Provana came home. The coroner, with the plan of the rooms before him, pointed to that occupied by Sedgwick. Was it possible for a stranger to have entered the house after or before your master without your hearing the opening of the door or his footsteps in the passage? Sedgwick concluded that it was possible, since the thing must have happened. He was ordinarily a particularly light sleeper. Was there ever a servant who confessed to being anything else? He had been to a theatre that evening and may have slept sounder than usual. Did none of the other men hear anything? John, footman, had heard the dog bark. John was duly sworn, and stated that he had been awakened by hearing the dog, an Irish terrier, and he had sat up in bed and listened, but the dog had given only that one bark, by which he, John, concluded that the animal, which slept on a mat outside his room, had been dreaming. Interrogated as to time, he had heard the hall clock strike 5, not very long after the dog barked. It might be a quarter of an hour, or it might be half an hour. On this followed the interrogation of stable servants as to the gates opening in Chiltern Street, the result of which showed that the stable gates had not been locked that morning. It was broad daylight when the grooms finished their work and turned in for a morning sleep. The last of the stable servants to retire had heard the clock strike 4 as he went to his bedroom. Mrs. Provana was there to answer all further questions concerning her style. She stood up by the table, facing the coroner. She stood there, an exquisite figure, slender and erect, her countenance and her attitude sublime in composure, grace, and refinement in every line. The few of her friends who had found their way into the court, and who were standing discreetly in the background, Mr. Simeon, Mr. Amphlett, and Lady Susan, Father Cyprian Hammond, Claude Rutherford, Eustace Lyon, the poet, these admired and wondered. With no vestige of colour in cheek or lip, with eyes that had grown larger in the new horror of her life, yet unutterably calm, with not one passing tremor in the low voice, and with not one instant of hesitation, she answered the coroner's questions. At what time had she fallen asleep after her return from Fulham Park? It must have been past 4 o'clock. Was your maid in attendance upon you when you went to bed? No, I have never allowed my maid to sit up for me after a late party. Are you a heavy sleeper? Not usually, but I was very tired that night. Eustace Lyon noticed that she spoke of that night, the night before last, as if it had been ages ago. The fact appealed to his imagination as a poet. He remarked afterwards that it was only poets who perceive such subtle indications. Did you hear nothing between 6 and 8:30? Nothing. A plan of the upper floor was lying in front of the coroner, and he was studying the position of the rooms. The room in which the shot was fired has a door communicating with your bedroom. Yes. Was that door shut? It is always shut. Shut, but not locked. No, it was not locked. The poet and Mr. Simeon looked at each other as she made this answer, with unalterable composure. The coroner was an elderly man, a doctor, grave always, but especially so on this occasion, for this was an exceptional case, and appealed to him in an exceptional manner. The murder was even more mysterious than terrible, and he was at once touched and mystified by the unshaken composure of this young woman, who had been awakened from her morning sleep to be told that her husband had been murdered within a few yards of the room where she had been sleeping, full of happy dreams, perhaps after the pleasant excitement of a dance. Except for a strained look in the large grey eyes, there was nothing in her aspect to indicate the ordeal through which she had passed within the last 2 days. "Isn't she simply wonderful?" murmured Susan Amphlett in the ear of Mr. Simeon, who was standing by her chair. "She has been like that ever since." There was no need to say since what. "I was with her all yesterday, but it was not a bit of use. She has turned to stone. Not a tear, not a cry, only that dreadful look in her eyes, as if she were seeing him murdered. It would have been a relief to hear her scream or burst into a flood of tears." "That kind of woman does neither," said Simeon. She is a grand soul, not a bundle of nerves. She has force and courage, and she knows that death does not matter. The coroner treated this witness with the utmost respect, but he did not spare her. A crime so extraordinary demanded a severe investigation, and searching questions had to be asked. Had Mr. Provana a quarrel with anybody, either in his social or business relations? Did the witness know of any incident in her husband's life, in England or in Italy, which might suggest a motive for the crime? The answer to both questions was a negative. But he might have had a secret enemy without your knowledge. It is possible. He would not have told me anything that would have made me anxious or unhappy. For the first time there was a faint tremor in her voice as she said this, and the poet whispered 3 words in Lady Susan's ear. She loved him. Asked whether she expected her husband's return, she replied that she had received no cablegram naming the steamer by which he was to return. She had received letters and cablegrams, but none within the last 6 days before his death. Asked whether they were on good terms when he left England, she replied that there had never been a difference of any kind between them. She refused to be seated during this ordeal, and stood facing her questioner till he had asked his last question, and when Lady Okehampton came to her, wanting to lead her away, she insisted upon remaining near the end of the table, where the witnesses came one after another to give their evidence. The coroner heard those low, distinct words, "I want to hear everything," and he noted how she stood there, watching and listening to the end of the inquiry, regardless of her aunt's endeavour to get her away from the spot. A confidential clerk from Mr. Provana's office in Lombard Street was able to give an account of the safe in his principal's dressing room, as he had often been in the room occupied in examining documents with his employer and in taking shorthand notes for letters to be written in Lombard Street. He had examined the contents of the safe after the murder. The door had been opened with Mr. Provana's private key, which he always carried about him. Certain securities were missing, but the valuables abstracted were of a much less amount than might have been taken by anyone acquainted with the nature of the papers the safe contained, and able to use his knowledge to advantage. 2 parcels of foreign bonds were missing, the present value of which would be about £6,000. The witness had an inventory of everything in this safe, and he had found all other parcels intact, although the contents of the drawers and shelves had been greatly disturbed, and the papers thrown about as if some person in haste. Would these bonds be easily convertible into cash? They are bonds to bearer, and there would be no difficulty of disposing of them at their value. The inquiry was adjourned. Vera was surrounded by her friends, Lady Okehampton, Lady Susan, Mr. Simeon, and Claude Rutherford. Even Eustace Lyon ventured to approach her. "Forgive me for intruding at such a moment," she said, almost breathless with excitement. "I feel that I must speak. You are sublime. Simeon is right. You are spirit and not clay. It needs something more than flesh and blood to go through what you have endured today." She looked at him with the same strained look in her eyes with which she had looked at the coroner, a look of surprise, as if, in the midst of a dream, she had been startled by a living voice. End of chapter 13. Recording by Sarah in Brighton.
Chapter 14 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dylan Campbell. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 14. Vera insisted on going back to the house of death, although her aunt and Susan Amphlett were equally urgent in trying to take her home with them. "Why should you make a martyr of yourself?" Susie urged in her vehement way. "You can do him no good. He will not know. All the dead want is silence and darkness, and to be mourned by those they love. You will mourn for him just as sincerely in my dainty spare room in Green Street as in that wilderness of empty rooms where he lies." "Yes, I shall mourn for him," said Vera in low, measured tones. "I shall mourn for him all my life." No, Shetty," murmured Susan confidently as they moved towards the door. "You will always be sorry for his quite too dreadful death, and you will remember all his goodness and absolute devotion to you. But you have your own life before you. You are not like some poor old thing, who feels that life is done with when she is left a widow, nothing to look forward to but charity bazaars and pug dogs. Remember how young you are, child, almost on the threshold of life. You don't know how I envy you when I think I am such ages older. You are going to be immensely rich, and by you will marry someone you can adore, as poor Provana adored you. And whatever you do, Vera, don't wait till you are fat and elderly, and then marry a boy, as I've known a widow do, out of respect for a first husband. Susan felt she had now hit upon the right note, and was really a consoler, but nothing she could say had any effect upon her friend. "I am going home," she said. "The house is dreadful, but I'd rather be there than anywhere else." She had only the same answer for her aunt when urged to stay at Berkeley Square, at least until all this troublesome business of the inquest is over. "I can't think why the coroner could not have finished today," Lady Okehampton said to her husband at dinner that evening. "They had the doctor's evidence, and the servants, and the clerks. All the circumstances were made clear. Every detail of the poor thing's death was gone into. What more could be wanted?" "Only one detail. To find the murderer. If ever I were to be murdered, I hope the inquiry would address itself more to the man who did it than to the way in which it was done, and that the coroner would stick to his work till he found the fellow who killed me. If he didn't, I believe I should walk at midnight, like Hamlet's father." Claude Rutherford was among the friends who surrounded Vera as she left the court. His mother was with him, an unexpected figure in such a scene, and while her son said no word, Mrs. Rutherford murmured the gentle assurance of her sympathy. She had held herself aloof from Vera for a long time, disapproving of an intimacy in which she saw danger for her son, and discredit for Mario Provana's wife. But she came to this dismal court today, moved by divine compassion for the fragile creature who had become the central figure in so awful a tragedy. For the first time since she had entered the court, Vera's strained eyeballs clouded with tears, and the hand which Mrs. Rutherford held with a friendly pressure trembled violently. That unnatural calm of the last 2 hours had given way in the surprise of this meeting. Her carriage was waiting for her, and she stepped into it too quickly for Claude to help her. He could only stand among the others to see her driven away. "It was more than good of you to come to this dreadful place," he told his mother as they walked towards Piccadilly. "I would do anything to help her, if it were possible. She has not made the best use of her life so far. Perhaps she has only gone with the stream, like the herd of modern women who seem to have neither heart nor conscience. But this tragedy was a terrible awakening, and no one can help being sorry for her. The ruck of her friends will not be sorry. They will only chatter about her husband's death, and discuss the amount of her fortune as his widow. You are right, mother. They have neither heart nor conscience. They care for nothing, hope for nothing, except to be better dressed and dine out oftener than other women." He spoke with unusual bitterness, and his mother looked at him anxiously. All the marks of a too feverish life showed upon his delicate countenance in the clear light of summer. He had never counted among handsome men, but a face so sensitive was more interesting than the beauty of line and color, and the people who knew Claude Rutherford knew that the sensitive face was the outward evidence of a highly emotional nature. "You are looking so tired and worn, Claude," his mother said anxiously. "Oh, this ghastly business has been a shock for me as well as for her. I was with her at the Fulham House ball the night before. We were waltzing in a mob of dancers, sitting out among tropical flowers, laughing together in the noise and laughter and foolish talk in the supper-room. Such diamonds, such bare shoulders and enamelled faces. It was 2:30 when I took her to her carriage, and a black bird was whistling in the avenue. Everybody was pretending to be happy, and she went alone to that great, gloomy house to be awakened a few hours later to be told that her husband had been murdered." "What could have been the motive for such a murder? Plunder? What else? Of course it was known that he kept valuables in that safe. How was it that he came home so unexpectedly?" "Heaven knows. Perhaps he wanted to give his wife a surprise. Grim joke in such a husband, and the result was grimmer than he could have anticipated." There was a savage bitterness in his tone that shocked the tender-hearted woman. "Don't speak of it like that, Claude. It is too dreadful to think of. He was a devoted husband from all that I have heard, only too blindly indulgent, letting his wife lead the wretched, empty-headed existence that can spoil even a good woman." They were at Mrs. Rutherford's door by this time, and she asked her son to give her a few minutes more before he went away. "As long as you like," he said. "I'm at a loose end. My usual diversions are out of the question, and all manner of work is impossible." "You must go away, Claude. You are too sensitive, too warm-hearted to get over this business easily. You ought to leave London for a long time." And then, with her hand on his shoulder, looking up at him with tearful solicitude, She enlarged upon that source of consolation to which a woman of deep religious convictions turns instinctively in the time of trouble. She reminded him of his happy and innocent boyhood, the unquestioning faith of those early years, before the leaven of doubt had entered his mind, before the Christian youth had become the trifler and cynic. He listened in silence with downcast eyes, and then, tenderly kissing her, he said gently, "Yes, perhaps there lies the cure. I must go back to those tranquil days. I must leave this hateful town. Yes, mother, I mean to go away, for a long time. I shall take your advice. If you see Father Hammond, I should like you to tell him about this talk of ours." "Why not go to him at once and make your confession? You'd feel happier afterwards." "I have not come to that yet. I mean to have a talk with him later. Arrivederci, madre mia." "Where are you going?" "I don't know. To my rooms, most likely. I have letters to write." He was gone before she could question him further. That business of letter writing was the most arduous work he knew. Since he had chucked art, his days had no more strenuous employment. His life was the over-occupied existence of a man of pleasure. End of chapter 14. Recording by Dylan Campbell. Chapter 15 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dylan Campbell. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 15. Lord Okehampton, discussing the financier's fate in a tete-a-tete dinner with his wife, was only one among a multitude who were thinking of the Provana murder. There is nothing that English men and women enjoy more than the crime which they call a really good murder. They will import sensation cases from America or the colonies, and they will try to feel as keenly interested in a murder in New York or Melbourne as in a London tragedy. But the keen relish is lacking where the crime has been done afar off. It is impossible to realize the scene in unfamiliar surroundings. The sense of nearness of the street or the countryside we know is a strong factor in the interest of the story. To the man who knows his Paris thoroughly, a Parisian crime may appeal, but to the woman who buys frocks in the Rue de la Paix and hats on the Boulevard des Italiens, the most diabolical murder in the Marais or on the heights of Belleville seems tame. Thus, the murder of a millionaire in the midst of the rich man's London was a crime that set every sensation-seeker theorizing and arguing. Every man is, at heart, a Sherlock Holmes, while every woman thinks herself a criminal investigator by instinct, and the theories worked out and expounded over tea tables, and maintained with a red-hot intensity, were various and startling. The most sanguinary murder is a poor thing if people know how and by whom it was done. Mystery is essential in a crime that is to occupy the mind of the public. The murder in the great house in Portland Place had all the elements of enduring success: wealth, beauty, secrecy, and that Italian flavor which offered poignant possibilities of jealousy or revenge, or perhaps a lifelong vendetta as the motive of the crime. The inquiry in the coroner's court dragged slowly towards an indeterminate and unsatisfactory close, being adjourned at long intervals to give the police time to make discoveries. So far the police had made no discoveries, and the daily press was beginning to be angry with the Criminal Investigation Department, and to make uncivil comparisons between the home article and the same thing in France and Germany. In the meantime, the newspapers found subject for occasional paragraphs, though they had no new facts to communicate. So long as the inquest went on, picturesque reporters found a spacious field for their pen in the descriptions of witnesses and spectators in the coroner's court, the spectators being mostly women of some fashion, and more or less famous in the world of art and letters. The stage also had been represented among that morbidly curious crowd, popular actresses coming to study the appearance and demeanor of the young widow, whose marble column in the witness box had been written and talked about. But in spite of searching and patient inquiry, the murder in Portland Place remained an insoluble mystery, a standing reproach against Scotland Yard. While the man in the street and the daily papers he battens upon were expatiating upon the supineness and incompetency of the Criminal Investigation Department, the chief of that department was not idle. Scotland Yard is not greatly in favor of the offering of rewards for the apprehension of criminals. Scotland Yard has an idea that such offers do more harm than good, and prefers to rely upon the intelligence of its officials, and on that spontaneous and disinterested help which is often afforded by outsiders. But after the man in the street had expanded much wonder and indignation upon the fact that no reward had as yet been offered by the murdered man's widow or family, The Disbrows had taken upon themselves to arouse Vera to a proper sense of her position and responsibilities. Among Provana's friends and allies in the city, the great semi-oriental banking house of Messrs. Zeba and Zalmuna, with whom he had been closely associated, and other firms almost as distinguished, there was also a feeling that strong measures were required, and some wonderment that the widow had as yet done nothing. Lady Okehampton, who had been in Portland Place nearly every day, although not always allowed to see her niece, took the matter in hand as spokeswoman for the Disbrows, and told Vera that she must offer a reward for the apprehension of her husband's murderer. "It ought to have been done before now," she said, "but you have been so lost in grief that I have been afraid to talk of poor Provana. However, as time goes on, people must think it extraordinary that you can let things slide, especially after that splendid will which makes you the richest woman in London." The splendid will, executed in the first year of her marriage, left Vera residuary legatee, after a long list of legacies, which, although generous, did not absorb more than a sixth of Mario Provana's estate. If not actually the richest woman in London, a fact not easily to be ascertained, Vera was at least rich enough to support that reputation. She gave a little moan of anguish when her aunt spoke of the will, and replied with averted face that her uncle was to do whatever he thought right. Before darkness came down, the police stations of London exhibited bills offering £1,000 for information leading to the discovery of the murderer, and the man in the street was a little easier in his mind. In the meantime, Scotland Yard was pursuing its own course, and one of the most experienced and intelligent members of the force had the Provana affair in hand, and was actually established in Portland Place, where he was explained to the household as a picture restorer, who had been engaged by Mr. Provana shortly before he left England, to examine and restore certain pictures among those somewhat depressing examples of the early Italian school which gave gloom to the too spacious dining room. It might seem strange that work of this kind, ordered by the dead man, should be carried out at such a time, but Mr. James Japp of the Criminal Investigation Department had a power of impersonation which rarely failed him in the most critical circumstances, and having assumed the role of artistic man-of-all-work, he omitted no detail that could impress and convince the house servants, among whom he hoped to put his hand upon the murderer. Plausible, friendly, and altogether an acquisition in that low-spirited household, Mr. Japp, alias Johnson, was soon upon terms of cordial friendship with butler and housekeeper, while he was genially patronizing to the 4 stalwart footmen, and by no means standoffish to the coachman and his underlings, who sometimes crept into the servants' hall in the gloaming to talk over the last paragraph upon the mystery in Portland Place. For them, the mystery was meat and drink. They hung upon it with a morbid tenacity, never tired of restating the same facts and going over the same arguments and doing battle, each for his own solution of the ghastly problem. For these, Mr. Johnson, artist and picture restorer, was a godsend. The man was so delightfully innocent in the ways and workings of criminals. He showed the simple faith of a child when listening with avidity to Mr. Sedgwick's views, and allowed himself to be browbeaten by the coachman. He would turn the drift of the talk aside at a most interesting point to relate his early aspirations as a student, and his dismal failure as an artist, and how he had been driven from the painting of colossal historic pictures to the humbler art of the varnisher and restorer, working for a daily wage. He would tell stories of his early struggles that evolved laughter and good-natured scorn. He had a room allotted to him for his work, one of those rooms opening out of the long passage that led to Mr. Provana's private door, that door by which he and his murderer must have entered the house on the fatal night. Mr. Johnson had examined the door with studious attention, confessing to a morbid interest in the details of crime, coexisting with a curious ignorance of the law of the land. The nature and methods of a coroner's court had to be explained to him condescendingly by Mr. Sedgwick when the Provana murder was under discussion. He had his room for his artistic work, where he installed himself with 3 of the largest pictures from the dining room, his bottles of oil and varnish, and his stock of brushes, and where he insisted upon being undisturbed. He was of a nervous temperament, and could not bear to have his work looked at. He talked of his progress from day to day, expatiating upon the dangers of blue mold, the horrors of asphaltum, and other pernicious mediums, and the superiority of the old painters who ground their own colors. But no one, not even Mr. Sedgwick, was allowed to see him at work. He was altogether a superior person, yet it was something of a surprise to the household that he should be admitted every evening to an interview with Mrs. Provana, who received him in the great, lonely drawing-room, where he remained with her for about a quarter of an hour, giving an account of his day's work. This privilege was explained by Mr. Johnson as a natural result of the lady's interest in art, and the value she set upon pictures which it appeared were especial favourites with her husband. "At the rate he goes at, I don't fancy he could have much progress to report," remarked Mr. Sedgwick. for I don't believe he works a solid hour a day at those pictures. He takes things a bit too easily to my mind. He knows he's got a soft job, and he means to make it last as long as the missus will let him. He's got his head pretty well screwed on, has our friend Johnson, and he knows when he's in for a good thing, and he's got a tongue that would talk over a special commissioner of income tax, so no doubt he makes Mrs. Provana believe that he works heavens hard at fetching up the colour in the Fra Angelicas. I shall think something of his work if he can do anything to brighten up those Salvini roses, which are about the dismalest pictures I ever saw in a gentleman's dining room, the housekeeper remarked with conviction. Mr. Johnson was a desultory worker. He told his friends in the household that he worked like a tiger while he was at it, but your real artist was ever fitful in his toil. It was in the artistic temperament to be desultory. He would emerge from his den after an hour or so in a canvas apron so stained with oil and so sticky with varnish that none could doubt his industry. He was eminently sociable. He couldn't get on without company and conversation. The 4 young footmen afforded him inexhaustible amusement. The oldest of 'em ain't over 25, he said, but every one of 'em is a character in his way. Now I love studying character. There's no book, nor no illustrated magazine you can give me that I enjoy as I do human nature. Give me the human document, and leave your mouldy old books for mouldy old scholars. Every one of these 4 lads is a romance, if you know how to read 'em. This taste, which Mr. Sedgwick and Mrs. Manby thought low, led Mr. Johnson to consort in the friendliest way with the 4 youths in question. He had not been in the house a fortnight before he knew all about them. Their sweethearts, their ambitions, their taste for pleasure, and their craving for gain. Even the odd man, a creature whom the elite of the household esteemed as hardly human, a savage without a livery, by whom it was a hardship to be waited on at one's meals, was not without interest for Johnson. While he delighted in Mr. Sedgwick's company, and was proud to spend an evening with him at his club, he shocked everybody by taking the old man to a music hall and giving him supper after the entertainment. "I think you're all too hard upon Andrew," he said. "I find him distinctly human." With the ladies of the household he was at once friendly and gallant. He aired his little stock of French with Mamselle, and took her for evening walks in Regent's Park, which to dwellers north of Langham Place is the park. He bought her little gifts, and took her to the theatre. He played dummy whist with Mrs. Manby, who was sadly behind the age and could not abide bridge, and the result of all this friendly intercourse, which had kept the establishment in good spirits during a period of gloom, culminated one evening when he told Mrs. Provana that his residence under her roof had only a negative result, and that he had exhausted all the means in his power without arriving at any clue to the murderer of her husband. "It has been a great disappointment to me, madam," said Mr. Japp, standing before Vera with his hat in his hand, serious and subdued in manner and bearing. The change from the sociable and trivial Johnson to the businesslike and thoughtful Japp showed a remarkable power in the assumption of character. "It has been a most disappointing case I have been engaged in for a long time. I came into this house assured that I should put my hand upon the guilty party under this roof. Every circumstance indicated that the crime had been committed by someone inside the house. The idea of an outsider seemed incredible. That a house with such a staff of servants, with 5 men and an Irish terrier sleeping on the ground floor, could have been entered by a burglar seemed out of the question. Mr. Provana being known to keep large sums of money in one shape and another in the safe in his private room, and no doubt being also known to carry the keys of that safe upon his person, there was a sufficient inducement for robbery. While it is our common experience that any man bold enough to attempt robbery on a large scale is not the man to shrink from murder when his own skin is in danger. My theory is that one of your men servants had been waiting for his opportunity during Mr. Provana's absence in America, that he had provided himself with implements for forcing the lock of the safe, perhaps with the aid of an outside accomplice, and that, by a strange coincidence, he had stumbled upon the night of his master's unexpected return, and had been surprised at the beginning of his work. There are scratches on the polished steel about the lock of the safe that might be made by one of those graduated wedges which burglars use. I thought that, by being surprised by Mr. Provana's entrance, he snatched up one of the pistols from the case on the table, which he might have examined previously, and fired within narrow range, as Mr. Provana was about to open the door of your room, without having seen him, that he took the keys from Mr. Provana's pocket after he fell, unlocked the safe, and abstracted the 2 parcels of bonds which are missing. The disordered state of the safe, and the keys left in the lock indicate that everything was done in extreme haste. This is my theory before I came into your house, madam. But after nearly 5 weeks' careful study of every individual under this roof, I have reluctantly arrived at the conclusion that nobody in your household is in it, either as principal or accomplice, before or after the fact. I think it is in an old play that the remark has been made that murder will out, also that blood will have blood. Both remarks are perfectly correct, but there is another remark that might have been made with even greater truth, and that is, money will out. You can't hide money. At least the average criminal can't. That's where he gives himself away. He can't keep his plunder to himself. The money burns. It burns. He must spend it. Some spend it on drink. Some, begging your pardon, madam, spend it on ladies. Some, the weakest of the lot, spend it on clothes and handsome cabs. But spend they must. There's not one of those 4 young men that could keep 5 or 6 thou in his pocket and not give himself away, somehow or somewhere. Nor yet Mr. Sedgwick, fine gentleman and philosopher as he is, nor yet even the odd man. Being a poor creature, he'd have melted those securities with the first low fence he could hear of, and would have been on the drink night after night till he got the horrors and gave himself up to the police. I've been looking for the money, madam, and finding no trace of that, I know I've not come within range of the party we want. We must look outside, madam, and we may have to look a long way off. If the possessor of those bonds is an old hand, he is not likely to turn them into money anywhere in this city, for though they are bonds to bearer, a transaction of that kind must leave some trace. I feel the humiliation of my failure, madam, and I have no doubt you are disappointed. Vera looked up at him with melancholy eyes, pale, hollow-cheeked, a sombre figure in the severest mourning that the Maison de Deuil near the Madeleine could supply, and French mourning knows no compromise. Disappointed, she repeated slowly in a low, tired voice, and then, to Mr. Japp's surprise and almost horror, she said, I don't think it much matters whether the wretched creature who killed him is discovered or not. It can make no difference to him lying at rest, beyond all pain and sorrow, that his murderer is hidden somewhere out of reach of the law, and may escape the agony of a shameful death. The horror in her widening eyes as she said these words showed that her imagination could realize the horror of the scaffold. However he may escape human law, she went on in the same slow, dull tones, he must carry his punishment with him to the grave. He can never know one peaceful hour. He can never know the comfort of a dreamless sleep. He will be a haunted man. Excuse me for differing with you, madam, but you don't know what stuff the criminal classes are made of. They don't mind. One more or less sent to kingdom come don't prey upon their nerves. Where are they found, as a rule, when they do get nicked? Why, at a theatre, or in a music hall, or at the Derby, and generally in ladies' society. The things you read of in novels, conscience, remorse, Banquo's ghost, don't trouble them. Mr. Japp apologized for having expressed himself so freely, and stood for a few minutes fingering the brim of his hat, waiting for Mrs. Provana to speak. Her speech just now had been a surprise to him, for never had he met with so silent a lady. Night after night she had listened hungrily to his statement of his day's progress, his suspicions, his glimpses of light, now seeming full of promise and anon delusive. She had listened with keen attention, but she had expressed no opinion and had asked no questions. And now for him, the accomplished criminal investigator, the man who had worked at the science of detection as superior persons work at the higher mathematics, to hear this lady say that the discovery of her husband's murderer did not matter, that, for her part, he might go about the world a free man, with nothing worse than a mind full of scorpions and a sleepless bed, seemed too monstrous for comprehension. She, to whom the murdered man had left millions, not to hunger for the ignominious death of his murderer? It must be Christian Science, thought Mr. Japp as he packed his portmanteau. Nothing less can account for it. End of chapter 15. Recording by Dylan Campbell.
Chapter 16 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter number 16. Everybody in the Red Book had left London. The West End was a desert, and the shrill summons of the telephone was heard no more in Mayfair. Nobody, unless it were the caretaker, was being asked to luncheon or dinner, and the only tea parties were in the basement, where the late lettuce had not yet given place to the early muffin. Only people with urgent and onerous business were to be found in London. Lord Okehampton was shooting grouse, and Lady Okehampton ought to have been doing an after cure in Switzerland. But the sad state of my poor niece after her husband's ghastly death, and the legal business connected with her colossal inheritance, made it impossible for me to leave town. Much as I need a complete change, I must stay here, while the poor child wants me." This was what Lady Okehampton wrote from her deserted house in Berkeley Square to numerous friends, with more or less variation of phrase. Vera's health was now the most pressing question. She had taken her bereavement with a dumb, self-contained grief that is the most morbid and the most perilous kind of sorrow, the sorrow that kills. When questioned, pressingly but tenderly, by her aunt, she always replied in the same unresponsive manner. There was nothing the matter with her. Of course, as Aunt Mildred said, the shock had been terrible, but no doubt she would get over it in time. People always get over things. She only wanted to be left to herself. She was quite strong enough to bear her burden. No, she was not eating her heart out in solitude. It was best for her to be alone. "You are more than kind, Aunt Mildred, and so is Susan Amphlett. But I am better sitting quietly and thinking out my life." "But, my poor child, you are perishing visibly, just wasting away. I would rather see you in floods of tears, hysterical even, than in this hopeless state. What is the use of making a fuss? If tears could bring my husband back, and make life what it was before his death, I would drown myself in tears. But nothing can change the past. That is what makes life terrible. The things we have done are done forever." Lady Okehampton trembled, first for her niece's life, and next for her sanity. And here was the stupendous fortune left to Vera for her life, and to her children after her, her children by the husband who was dead, but, in default of such children, to be divided among a horde of Italian relations, third and fourth cousins, people for whom Mario Provana might not have cared twopence, and among Roman charitable institutions, surely to be badly managed, Lady Okehampton thought. It seemed to her that if Vera were to die, that stupendous wealth, which while she possessed it must be a factor in the position of the Disbrowes, would be absolutely thrown to the dogs. To divide that mass of riches into eighths and twelfths and sixteenths was in a manner to murder it. All its power and prestige would be gone, frittered away among insignificant people, who might be better off without it, as it would put a stop to laudable ambition and enterprise, and might ultimately be the cause of unmitigated harm. "It is so sad to think there were no children," sighed Lady Okehampton into the ears of various confidential friends. "The dear man made this will shortly after his marriage, and evidently built upon having a heir. He was so absolutely devoted to my niece. I know it was a bitter disappointment for him," concluded the chieftainess of the Disbrowes, to whom Mario Provana had said no word of his innermost feelings upon that or any other subject. Strange indeed would it have been for that strong hand to lift the curtain from that proud heart. Courteous, generous, chivalrous, he might be to the whole clan of Disbrowes. He might scatter his gold among them with a careless hand, but to scatter the secrets of his lonely life among the frivolous herd was impossible to the man who endured a mother's dislike, a father's neglect, and the disillusions of a marriage de convenance. without 1 hour of self-betrayal. Vera was childless, and on her frail thread of life hung Mario Provana's millions. Lady Okehampton told herself this in the watches of the night, and told herself that something must be done. It was all very well for Vera to declare that there was nothing the matter with her, while it was visible to the naked eye that the poor child was fading away in an atrophy of mind and body. "She will either die or go mad," said Lady Okehampton, and the alternative offered visions of a conseil de famille, doctors' certificates, and that rabble of fourth and fifth cousins tearing their prey. Long and confidential talks with Mrs. Manby, the housekeeper, and Louison, the maid, had revealed the desperate state of their mistress's health. "No, my lady, she doesn't complain," asserted Mrs. Manby. "I'm afraid it's all the worse because she won't complain. But she can't sleep, and she can't eat. Sedgwick knows what her meals are like. Just pretending, that's all. And Louison says that, go into her mistress's room when she will, in the middle of the night or in the early morning, she's always lying awake, sometimes reading, sometimes staring at the sky above the window sash, but asleep, never. And it isn't for want of taking things, for she has tried every drug you can put a name to." "Does the doctor prescribe them?" "He used to send her things, in the first few weeks after the funeral. But she made him believe that she was quite well, and was sleeping and eating as usual, and he left off coming. And then Lady Susan Amphlett brought her tabloids, always the newest thing out, but they've never done her any good. It's the mind that's wrong, my lady." "She was absolutely devoted to Mr. Provana," sighed Lady Okehampton. "No doubt, my lady." "And she can't get over her loss." "No, my lady." Susan Amphlett was of Aunt Mildred's opinion. Something must be done, and it must be done quickly, before any of those Roman cousins could appear upon the scene, prying and questioning, and hinting at a commission of lunacy. Things had come to a perilous pass, when Mrs. Manby, the housekeeper, could talk of her mistress's mind as the seat of the mischief. People who go out of their minds seldom take a long time about it, Lady Susan urged. It's generally touch and go. Lady Okehampton waited for no permission, but marched into her niece's room one dark September afternoon with the fashionable nerve specialist at her heels, the bland elderly physician from Cavendish Square, whom nobody in Mayfair had ever heard of till he had entered upon his 70th decade, and who had languished at the wrong end of Harley Street for a quarter of a century, before the great world had made the remarkable discovery that he was one man in London who could cure one of everything. He was kind and sensible, and really clever, but the great world loved him most because he had all the new names for old diseases at the tip of his tongue, and had the delightful manner which implied that the patient to whom he was talking was the one patient whose life he considered worth saving. "He really does think about you when he's feeling your pulse," said a dowager. "He ain't totting up last night's winnings at bridge all the time. He does really think, don't you know?" Dr. Selwyn Tower, as he held Vera's wasted wrist in his broad, soft hand, looked as serious as if the fate of a nation were at stake. Indeed, he had been told that millions were in jeopardy, and in the modern mind the destinies of big fortunes are as serious as the rise and fall of peoples. The physician asked no troublesome questions, but he contrived to keep Vera in conversation, on indifferent subjects, for about a quarter of an hour, her aunt joining in occasionally with sympathetic nothings, and by the end of that time he had made up his mind about the case, or at least about his immediate treatment of the case. He might have thought that went deeper and farther, but those could be held in abeyance. The thing to be done was to save this fragile form, which was obviously perishing. A rest cure! Nothing else would be of any use. An uncompromising rest cure. 6 weeks of solitary confinement in the care of a resident doctor and a couple of highly trained nurses. Lady Okehampton anticipated a struggle, remembering how resolutely Vera had resisted this line of treatment 3 months before, but her niece surprised her by offering no vehement opposition. "There is absolutely nothing the matter with me," she said, "but if it will please you, Aunt Mildred, I will do as Dr. Tower advises." "Nothing the matter! And you neither eat nor sleep. Is that nothing?" "Who told you that I can't sleep?" "My dear lady, your eyes tell us only too plainly. Insomnia has unmistakable symptoms," said the doctor. "Yes, it is true," Vera answering wearily. "I seem to have lost the faculty of sleep. It is a habit one soon loses. I lie staring at the daylight, and wondering what it is like to lose count of time." And then, after a little more doctor's talk, soothing, and rather meaningless, she asked abruptly, "What time of year is it?" "Dear child!" exclaimed Lady Okehampton. "Can you ask?" "Oh, I have left off writing letters and reading newspapers, and I forget dates. I know the days are getting shorter, because the dawn is so long coming when I lie awake." "We are in the middle of September," said the doctor. "A charming month for country air. Neither too hot nor too cold. The golden mean." "And in 6 weeks it will be the end of October, and I can go to Rome for the winter." "You could not do better. We shall build up your constitution in those 6 weeks. You will be another woman when you leave Sussex." "But my dearest Vera," protested her aunt, "you can never think of a winter alone in that enormous villa. You will die of ennui." "No, no, Aunt Mildred. I love Rome. The very atmosphere of the place is life to me. I am not afraid of being alone." Dr. Tower shot a significant look at her ladyship, which silenced remonstrance, and no more was said. 2 days later Vera found herself on a windy hill in Sussex, under the dominion of the house doctor and 2 nurses, and almost as much exposed to the elements as King Lear on the heights near Dover. An eider-down coverlet and a hot water bottle made the only difference. Lady Okehampton, having sacrificed her own cure to her niece's, went with a mind at ease to join her husband in Yorkshire, an arrangement almost without precedent in their domestic annals. End of chapter 19. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.